The unseen burden. The hum of the highway had become a familiar soundtrack to Tyler Davis and Jordan Blackwood, two seasoned FBI agents working deep undercover. For the past few months, the mission had consumed their lives, leaving them detached from anything resembling normalcy. They had infiltrated one of the largest international criminal networks, a syndicate involved in everything from drug trafficking to arms smuggling. And now, after what felt like an eternity, they were nearing the end of their assignment. The documents and evidence stored in the trunk of their car were enough to cripple the organization and bring down its key players. The sleek, black sedan glided effortlessly along the deserted highway, far from the bustle of the city where they had just concluded a pivotal meeting with a key informant. Tyler, with his steady hands on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, seemed calm on the surface, but beneath his composed exterior, a storm of tension brewed. His mind was on overdrive, racing through every detail of the night, scrutinizing every word exchanged during the meeting. Beside him, Jordan was silent, his sharp eyes scanning the endless stretch of road ahead. Though younger than Tyler, Jordan was no less experienced. He had a reputation for being quick-witted and outspoken, sometimes to his detriment. If Tyler was the calm strategist, Jordan was the one who wore his emotions on his sleeve. They complemented each other well, their partnership forged in the heat of countless operations. The weight of the night hung heavily between them. While their mission had been a success thus far, both men knew that danger still lurked around every corner. The final phase of any operation was always the most critical and the most dangerous. And in their case, there was an added layer of complexity. As black men in a predominantly white federal institution, they had learned to navigate a world where they were often viewed with suspicion, both in the streets and within the system they worked to protect. Tyler was a man who had fought to rise through the ranks of the FBI, his career built on hard work and determination. Yet, no matter how high he climbed, he could never entirely escape the shadow of racism that followed him. The badge he wore didn't always guarantee his safety or respect. He had seen it time and time again, how the color of his skin often made him a target of suspicion, even in situations where his credentials should have spoken for themselves. Jordan, more outspoken about these injustices, had his own scars from similar encounters. He didn't shy away from speaking his mind, especially when it came to the inequities he saw both in the world and within their line of work. For him, the reality of being a black man in law enforcement was a constant reminder that despite their titles, they were still subject to the biases and prejudices that permeated society. "Long night," Jordan muttered, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was low, but carried the exhaustion of the hours they had just endured. Tyler glanced at him briefly and nodded. "Yeah, almost home." The word home felt hollow. For them, home wasn't a place, but a fleeting concept, a temporary sanctuary between missions. In this case, it referred to the safe house where they had been operating for months. It wasn't comfort or warmth they sought. It was a place to regroup, assess their situation, and prepare for the final act of their dangerous assignment. Jordan shifted in his seat, rubbing his face as if trying to erase the fatigue that clung to him. "You think we got everything we need?" His tone held the unspoken concern that all their efforts might still fall short. Tyler didn't respond immediately. He knew how fragile their position was. Despite the hard evidence they had gathered tonight, they were still walking the tightrope. One wrong move could unravel everything. And for black agents like them, the stakes were even higher. Their every action was scrutinized more closely, their every decision weighed against biases they couldn't control. "We'll know soon enough," Tyler finally said, his voice steady. "For now, we just need to get back in one piece." As they continued down the highway, the tension in the car grew thicker, an invisible pressure that neither man could shake. Tyler's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, an old habit born from years of undercover work. The highway was mostly empty, save for a few cars scattered along the road. Still, something gnawed at him. There was a lingering sense of unease, as though danger was following them, lurking just out of sight. Then he saw it, the faint glow of blue and red lights in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Tyler's body stiffened, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Jordan," he said, his voice calm but laced with a warning. "We've got company." Jordan turned in his seat to look out the back window, his eyes narrowing as the flashing lights drew closer. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. "We weren't speeding, were we?" "No," Tyler replied, his jaw clenched. "But that doesn't always matter." They both knew what this could mean. They had been stopped before, too many times, for reasons that had nothing to do with their driving or adherence to the law. It was something every black man understood, especially those in positions of authority. No matter their status, no matter the badges they carried, there were moments when none of that mattered. Tyler slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as they came to a stop. Behind them, the police cruiser pulled in, its lights casting an ominous red and blue glow across the empty highway. For a moment, neither Tyler nor Jordan said anything. They didn't need to. The unspoken understanding between them was palpable. "Stay calm," Tyler said softly, though the words were as much for himself as for Jordan. "We'll handle this." Jordan nodded, but Tyler could see the anger simmering just below the surface. They had been through this routine too many times before, and it never got any easier. Moments later, the doors of the police cruiser opened, and two white officers stepped out. Tyler watched them in the rearview mirror, his senses heightened. Something about their posture, the way they approached the car, set off alarm bells in his mind. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. The younger of the two officers, a tall, lean man with a sharp jawline, approached Tyler's window. His expression was hard, and his eyes swept over the car with a look that carried no warmth or professionalism. There were no pleasantries, no polite inquiries. "License and registration," he barked, his tone cold and demanding. Tyler felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was a situation he had trained for countless times, but it was always different when it happened in real life. His badge was in his pocket, and his instincts screamed at him to keep it there for the moment. He had to gauge the situation carefully. Flashing the badge too early could escalate things, and right now, these officers were already on edge. Beside him, Jordan shifted slightly, his body language tense. Tyler knew what he was thinking. That familiar frustration, the anger at being treated like a suspect instead of an agent of the law. But they had to play this smart. This wasn't just about them. It was about the mission, the evidence in the trunk, and the lives they were trying to protect. Tyler kept his voice calm, measured. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my..." Before he could finish, the other officer, who had circled around to Jordan's side of the car, shouted, "Keep your hands where I can see them." The tension in the air snapped like a taut wire, and in that instant, both Tyler and Jordan knew this wasn't going to be a simple traffic stop. This was something far more dangerous. The thin line between control and chaos. The flashing red and blue lights pulsed in the night, casting an eerie glow on the dark, empty highway. Inside the sit-in, Tyler and Jordan remained still, their bodies tense but composed, caught between the weight of their situation and the training that had been drilled into them over the years. Tyler's heartbeat had slowed to a steady rhythm, calm, calculated, but his mind was anything but at ease. His eyes flickered between the two officers who approached, both white, both rigid in their movements, and both armed with the unspoken authority that came with their badges. Tyler had seen this look before. He had felt this energy before, the kind that made every second a dangerous game of judgment, where the wrong word or the wrong move could spiral into something far more violent. It was a tightrope that black men, even those in law enforcement, often had to walk. Jordan, to his credit, was holding himself together, but Tyler could feel the fire burning beneath his partner's skin. Jordan was a man who didn't take kindly to being disrespected, especially when it was unwarranted. But he also knew how to navigate situations like this. He had to. The officer on Jordan's side, a stocky man with a shaved head, kept his hand dangerously close to the gun on his hip. His other hand was holding a flashlight, which he pointed directly at Jordan's face, an aggressive move designed not to illuminate but to dominate. Jordan's face tightened, the muscles in his jaw clenching as the harsh beam blinded him. "Step out of the car," the stocky officer ordered, his voice low and threatening. His eyes were narrow, assessing, looking for something, anything, that would justify the aggression he was already showing. Tyler's instincts kicked in immediately. He knew they had to de-escalate this situation before it spiraled out of control. This wasn't about the law. This was about survival. He'd been in too many close calls to believe otherwise. "Officer," Tyler began, his voice level, "I'm reaching for my badge. I'm an FBI agent. We're both federal agents." For a brief second, there was a pause. The young officer who had barked at them for their licenses faltered, his eyes narrowing as he processed Tyler's words. But the stocky one wasn't having it. His flashlight beam didn't waver, nor did his hand near his weapon. "I said step out of the car," he repeated, ignoring Tyler's words as if they held no weight. His voice had sharpened, and his tone left no room for discussion. Jordan's frustration boiled over. "You hear him. We're federal agents. What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice carried the edge of someone who was done playing games, who was done being disrespected. The young officer's hand moved toward his gun, the same motion Tyler had seen too many times in his life. The unspoken threat in that gesture was clear, and it sent a chill through him. "Whoa, whoa," Tyler said quickly, lifting both his hands higher so they were visible through the windshield, making it abundantly clear that he wasn't reaching for anything. His FBI badge was still tucked in the breast pocket of his jacket, but it may as well have been invisible to these men. "We're doing exactly what you say. We're getting out. Just don't do anything stupid." Tyler slowly opened his door, keeping his movements exaggerated and deliberate. He had to make sure the officers saw everything he was doing. In the tense quiet that hung between them, every motion mattered. Jordan followed suit, though the anger radiating off of him was palpable. His eyes never left the stocky officer, who seemed all too eager for an excuse to escalate this encounter. As Tyler stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit him, though it did nothing to calm the heat rising in his chest. The young officer stepped closer, his hand still hovering near his weapon, as if waiting for an excuse to draw it. Tyler noticed how the young man's eyes flicked nervously between him and Jordan, as if calculating their every move, anticipating resistance. "Turn around," the stocky officer ordered. His voice was firm, but carried an undercurrent of impatience. Tyler complied, slowly turning his back to the officers. He could feel their eyes on him, scrutinizing his every movement, looking for any hint of defiance. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jordan turning as well, his jaw set in a tight line. "We're federal agents," Tyler repeated, his voice calm but firm. He needed to remind them of the reality of the situation, to bring them back from whatever power trip they were on. "My badge is in my jacket. Let me show you." "Shut up and put your hands on the car," the stocky officer snapped, cutting Tyler off. His voice was sharp, filled with a sense of entitlement and authority that had no room for negotiation. Tyler's hands rested against the cool metal of the sit-in, the very car that, minutes ago, had felt like a sanctuary, but now seemed more like a trap. His mind raced as he tried to assess the situation. He knew that if they didn't handle this perfectly, it could go south very quickly. The young officer moved closer to Jordan, his posture stiff with tension. "You've got something to say, boy," he sneered, his words dripping with condescension. The insult hung in the air, thick with history, laced with centuries of pain that couldn't be washed away by time or rank. Jordan tensed, his hands gripping the top of the car harder than necessary. Tyler could see his partner struggling to keep his temper in check. Jordan wasn't one to back down, but they couldn't afford to let this escalate. Not here. Not now. Tyler spoke up, trying to defuse the situation before it exploded. "We're complying, officers. There's no need for this." The stocky officer ignored him, stepping closer to Tyler's side. His voice dropped lower, his breath close enough that Tyler could feel it on the back of his neck. "You think that badge means something out here? You think we're just gonna let you off because you say you're FBI?" Tyler swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth, his body tense with the knowledge that this had nothing to do with the law or justice. This was about power. The stocky officer wanted to prove something, to show that out here, in the middle of nowhere, he held the cards. And no badge, no title, could change that. A silence fell over the scene, punctuated only by the hum of the police cruiser's engine and the distant sound of crickets in the nearby fields. It was the kind of silence that Tyler had learned to fear, the kind that usually preceded something violent. In the stillness, Tyler's mind raced through his options. He could push back, assert his authority as a federal agent. But he knew that wouldn't go the way it should. Not with men like this. He could sense their need to dominate, to make sure that two black men knew their place, badges or not. Suddenly, the young officer reached for Jordan's arm, yanking it roughly behind his back. Jordan jerked instinctively, trying to pull away from the painful grip. "What the hell are you doing?" Jordan spat, his voice filled with fury. But before he could say anything else, the young officer shoved him hard against the car, pinning him there. Tyler's pulse quickened. "Easy," he shouted, taking a step toward them. But the stocky officer was quicker. His hand shot out, pushing Tyler back against the hood of the car with more force than necessary. "Stay where you are," the stocky officer growled, his voice low and menacing. Tyler froze, his hand still raised. He had been in worse situations than this, but the fear in his gut was real. He wasn't afraid of the officers themselves. He had faced far more dangerous men in his career. But the unpredictability of this moment, the fact that two men with guns and badges felt they had the right to do whatever they wanted simply because of their position, made this situation far more dangerous. He had to think fast. He couldn't let this continue. The evidence in the trunk was too important, and they were too close to the finish line to let this derail their entire operation. But most of all, he couldn't let these officers have the satisfaction of humiliating them. "We're not resisting," Tyler said, his voice firm. "This doesn't need to go any further." The stocky officer chuckled, a cruel sound that sent a chill down Tyler's spine. "Oh, it's going further. Believe that." Tyler's eyes met Jordan's, and in that brief moment, he saw the same understanding. They were walking a thin line between control and chaos, and every second counted. Tyler knew that he had to find a way out of this, not just for themselves, but for the mission they had worked so hard to complete. But as the stocky officer's grip on his arm tightened, Tyler realized that this night was far from over, stripping away the illusion of control. The grip of the stocky officer dug into Tyler's arm, the pressure so deliberate it sent a sharp, numbing ache down to his fingers. Tyler gritted his teeth but remained still. His training told him not to escalate, not to make any sudden moves. But inside, a different kind of storm raged. This wasn't just another routine stop gone wrong. It was a slow, deliberate violation of everything he thought his badge had once represented. The wind stirred, carrying with it the distant, eerie whistle of the late-night highway. The road stretched endlessly into the dark, barren expanse, as if to emphasize the isolation they faced. Tyler's thoughts raced, not with fear. He had faced too many dangers to be driven by fear, but with anger. The raw, unfiltered rage of a man who had worked his entire life to uphold the law only to be held hostage by it. Jordan, pinned against the car just a few feet away, was breathing heavily, his hand splayed on the cold surface of the sit-in's roof. His eyes were dark pools of fury, glaring at the young officer who had shoved him. Jordan wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially one as blatantly unjust as this, but he knew better. His voice came out in a low, dangerous growl. "You want to tell me what exactly we did wrong? Or are you just going to keep pushing us around?" The young officer, a man barely in his 30s, with the rough, unshaven look of someone who had already decided his place in the world, sneered at Jordan. His hand lingered near the gun on his belt, a subtle but unmistakable warning. "Keep your mouth shut," the young officer snapped, his face contorted in an ugly sneer. "You think you're tough because you flash an FBI badge. Out here, that means nothing." The words stung, but not because of their content. They stung because Tyler knew this officer was right, at least in his own mind. Here, on this empty highway, far from the bright lights and the oversight of anyone who might care, the power was in the hands of the men with guns and badges. And right now, those men were more interested in asserting their dominance than in enforcing the law. Tyler's mind buzzed with the weight of the evidence they carried. The documents and data stored in the trunk of the car weren't just a smoking gun. They were a bomb waiting to go off in the hands of the FBI. A bomb that could dismantle a criminal empire that spanned continents. They were inches away from pulling it all off, if they could just get out of this situation without it spiraling out of control. He tried again, keeping his voice calm, controlled. "Officer, we're federal agents. There's a misunderstanding here. Let us show you our credentials, and we can clear this up." The stocky officer, who still had his meaty hand clamped around Tyler's arm, finally leaned in closer, his breath hot and foul against Tyler's ear. "You think I don't know what you are?" he hissed. "I know exactly what you are. But out here, you're just another two black men who don't know their place." Tyler's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was the reality he had lived with his entire life, the one he had thought he could rise above. But it never went away. Not really. The uniform, the badge, the authority, none of it could erase the way men like this saw him. Behind him, Jordan couldn't keep quiet any longer. "You're out of your mind if you think this is going to fly. We're on a federal operation, and when the Bureau gets wind of this, your careers are done." The young officer, perhaps sensing his partner's simmering anger, stepped forward and shoved Jordan harder against the car. "You think anyone's gonna believe you? Out here, who's gonna back you up? Your federal operation. You'll be lucky if anyone even remembers your names." Tyler's grip on the situation was slipping. He knew this game, had seen it played out too many times. These officers weren't looking for lawbreakers. They were looking for a show of power. And right now, they had no intention of letting Tyler and Jordan leave with their dignity intact. The stocky officer suddenly let go of Tyler's arm, only to shove him roughly against the hood of the car. Tyler's chest hit the cold metal with a thud, knocking the air out of him momentarily. His fists clenched as he fought back the instinct to resist, to fight back. Every muscle in his body screamed to act, to take control of the situation. But he couldn't. Not here. Not like this. Jordan turned his head slightly, enough to catch Tyler's eye. There was fire in his gaze, but also an understanding. They both knew what was at stake. The operation. The evidence. Their lives. They couldn't afford to let this moment be their undoing. They couldn't afford to let these officers get what they wanted. A reason to escalate. Tyler's voice came out strained but controlled. "We're not resisting. But we are federal agents, and we are on a classified operation. You need to call your supervisor." The stocky officer paused for a moment, his small, pig-like eyes narrowing as if weighing the risk. But whatever hesitation he felt was drowned out by the intoxicating feeling of power. He smirked, a slow, cruel expression that sent a wave of fury through Tyler. "No need for that," the officer said. "We'll handle this ourselves." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. Tyler's mind raced. If they couldn't talk their way out of this, then they needed another option, and fast. He glanced toward the highway, hoping, praying that another car would pass by, someone who might witness this and intervene. But the road remained dark and empty, a silent accomplice to what was unfolding. Jordan, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper, said, "Tyler, we can't let this go on." Tyler knew what he meant. He knew the line they were walking was razor thin, and it wouldn't take much for these officers to push them over the edge. But he also knew that acting too soon, too aggressively, would only give the officers exactly what they wanted, a reason to escalate to violence. "We won't," Tyler muttered, his voice low but filled with a quiet determination. "But we have to be smart. They don't know who they're dealing with." The stocky officer stepped back, glancing at his partner, who seemed eager to keep pushing. But there was a flicker of uncertainty now. The mention of a federal operation had planted a seed of doubt, however small. The young officer, still seething with a dangerous mix of arrogance and insecurity, spat on the ground near Jordan's feet. "You think you can come into our town and pull rank? You're in the wrong place for that. This is our territory." Tyler straightened slowly, keeping his hands visible, his every movement deliberate. "We're not trying to pull rank. We're trying to avoid a mistake that's going to cost you more than you realize. There's evidence in that trunk that's part of a major federal case. If anything happens to us, or that evidence, your careers are over. Call your supervisor." The two officers exchanged a glance, the tension between them palpable. Tyler could see the flicker of doubt growing, but it wasn't enough to disarm the situation. Not yet. Jordan, still pressed against the car, but no longer as tense, added, "You don't want this to go where it's heading. I promise you." For a long, excruciating moment, no one moved. The air between them felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Tyler's mind raced through every possible scenario, trying to calculate the best way out of this without it turning into a disaster. He knew that the wrong move would not only endanger their lives, but potentially jeopardize months of work on their case. If the evidence in that trunk was lost or compromised, they would lose their only chance to take down the criminal network they'd spent years infiltrating. Finally, the stocky officer broke the silence, but not with words. He reached for his radio, his eyes still locked on Tyler and Jordan, as if daring them to make a wrong move. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. We've got two individuals claiming to be federal agents, requesting confirmation." His voice, though calm, was laced with contempt. To him, they were still suspects, still two black men in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the shift in tone was unmistakable. He had opened the door, if only slightly, to the possibility that Tyler and Jordan were telling the truth. The young officer, however, wasn't as willing to back down. "You really think the feds are gonna back these guys up? Just look at them." Tyler's jaw tightened at the barely concealed racism in the young officer's words, but he kept his response measured. "You're about to find out exactly who backs us up." There was a crackle from the radio, followed by the voice of the dispatcher. "Officer Reynolds, we've confirmed identification on those individuals. They're federal agents, assigned to a classified operation. Stand down and let them proceed." The words were a lifeline, cutting through the tension like a knife. Tyler could see the stocky officer's face tighten with frustration, but he knew the game was over. He had lost the upper hand. The young officer, however, was still fuming, his hand twitching near his gun, as if he wasn't ready to let go of the control he thought he had. But before he could say anything, Officer Reynolds barked, "That's enough, Daniels. Let it go." With one last hateful glance, Daniels stepped back, his body radiating with barely contained rage. Tyler exhaled slowly, the weight on his chest lifting, but only slightly. This wasn't a victory. It was a reminder. A reminder of how fragile the line between authority and oppression truly was. Reynolds holstered his weapon and nodded toward the car. "Get out of here." But as Tyler and Jordan moved to leave, Tyler's eyes locked with Reynolds one last time, and in that brief moment, the truth hung between them. This wasn't over. It never really was. As they pulled back onto the highway, the darkness swallowed them once again, but the weight of the night clung to them like a shadow. The mission still loomed ahead, but now, more than ever, they understood just how dangerous their path had become, not just because of the criminals they were after, but because of the system that seemed determined to break them down. Into the eye of the storm, the headlights of their sedan sliced through the thick, inky darkness of the rural highway, But Tyler Davis and Jordan Blackwood barely noticed the road stretching out before them. The oppressive weight of what had just happened sat heavily in the car, like an unwanted passenger neither could shake. Silence filled the space between them, but it wasn't peaceful. It was loaded with the unspoken realities of the world they lived in. The tense standoff with the two officers still lingered in the air, haunting their thoughts, making the adrenaline that had been pumping through their veins feel sour and toxic. Tyler's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as he drove, his jaw clenched in frustration. He couldn't shake the words of the young officer Daniels, the smugness in his voice, the cold dismissal of their authority. It was a reminder of a hard truth Tyler had tried to outrun his entire career. His badge didn't protect him from the very system he had sworn to uphold. Out there, in the shadow of the law, it didn't matter that he was an FBI agent. To men like those officers, Tyler and Jordan were still black men first. Jordan sat rigid in the passenger seat, his fists clenched in his lap, staring straight ahead, his breathing still heavy with restrained anger. He had always been the more vocal of the two, the one who spoke up when something wasn't right, the one who pushed back against the injustices they faced both inside and outside the Bureau. Tonight, however, there had been nothing he could do but play along, endure the humiliation, and hope they came out of it alive. His body still vibrated with the tension of it all. "Man, I swear, I'm so sick of this shit," Jordan finally muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was low but laced with a fury that had no outlet. "How many times? How many damn times do we have to go through this? We're federal agents, for God's sake." Tyler didn't answer immediately. His mind was still replaying the encounter, analyzing every moment, trying to figure out how things could have gone differently. How close had they come to disaster? One wrong move, one misplaced word, and those officers could have turned the situation into something far worse. That was the part that gnawed at Tyler the most, the knowledge that, no matter how calm and controlled they had been, they had never truly been in control. "I don't know, man," Tyler finally said, his voice steady but hollow. He hated that he didn't have an answer. He hated that he didn't know how to make it stop. "But what can we do? We were 5 seconds away from them, pulling their guns." Jordan shook his head, his frustration palpable. "It's not just about them, Tyler. It's about all of it. We're out here risking our lives, doing the job, and what do we get for it? This. Pulled over, treated like criminals. And if we push back too hard, we end up dead on the side of the road, and you know damn well no one's gonna care. 2 black men, shot by the police. End of story." Tyler glanced at Jordan, the weight of his words settling heavily in the pit of his stomach. Jordan wasn't wrong. There had been too many names, too many faces, plastered across the news, reduced to hashtags and memorials after encounters that ended just like the one they had narrowly avoided tonight. It didn't matter that they were FBI agents. In that moment, to those officers, they had been something less. And that was a bitter truth to swallow. "I know," Tyler said quietly, his voice thick with the exhaustion of carrying that burden for so long. "But we've still got a job to do. If we let this stop us now, everything we've been working toward, all the evidence, the operation, it's all gone. And those bastards will walk free." Jordan exhaled sharply, his frustration still simmering, but he knew Tyler was right. They were too deep into this mission to let their anger derail everything. They were days, maybe even hours, away from bringing down one of the most dangerous criminal syndicates they had ever gone after. Months of undercover work, dangerous infiltrations, and gathering incriminating evidence. It had all led to this moment. They couldn't afford to let anything, not even the weight of injustice, pull them off course. Jordan's voice trailed off, his thoughts a jumbled mess of anger, fatigue, and resignation. He rubbed his hands over his face, trying to wipe away the tension that clung to him. "I just wish it didn't always have to be this way, you know. I wish for once we didn't have to walk around like we're the ones on trial." Tyler didn't respond. There was nothing he could say to make it better. Jordan was right, and they both knew it. The world they lived in, the system they worked within, was flawed in ways they had no power to fix. All they could do was keep their heads down, do their jobs, and hope that by the end of it, they would still be standing. The Satan hummed down the highway, the landscape outside a blur of darkness. The safe house where they had been operating out of for the last few months wasn't far now, and with every mile they drew closer, the tension in the car shifted. The immediate danger of the traffic stop had passed, but the real danger still loomed ahead. The mission wasn't over, and the final phase of their operation would be the most dangerous part yet. Tyler stole a glance at the rearview mirror, his mind on high alert. It wasn't just the police they had to worry about. They were deep inside enemy territory now. The criminal network they had been infiltrating wasn't just powerful. It was well-connected, ruthless, and merciless. If anyone within the organization caught wind of who Tyler and Jordan really were, there would be no stopping the bloodbath that would follow. Almost there, Tyler muttered, more to himself than to Jordan. The lights of a distant farmhouse flickered on the horizon, their safe house disguised as an abandoned property nestled deep in the countryside. To any passerby, it looked like nothing more than a forgotten relic of another time. But inside, it was their base of operations, the nerve center of their undercover work. Jordan, still seething from the earlier encounter, gave a curt nod. Good. I need to get my hands on that evidence. We got to make sure it's all intact before the final drop. Tyler understood the urgency in Jordan's voice. The documents and evidence they had gathered over the last few months were everything. They were the lifeline that would dismantle the organization they had spent so long bringing down. But they were also a ticking time bomb. If anyone within the syndicate realized what was in that trunk before they could make the drop, Tyler and Jordan wouldn't live long enough to see justice served. They pulled into the dirt driveway of the farmhouse, the tires crunching over the gravel as Tyler brought the car to a slow stop. The house stood in eerie silence, its windows dark and shuttered, the night casting long shadows across its weathered wooden facade. The wind whistled through the trees surrounding the property, and for a brief moment, the isolation of the place seemed to mirror the isolation they felt in their lives. Tyler turned off the engine, and for a few moments, neither of them moved. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy with the unspoken fears they both carried. Outside, the night was still, but that stillness carried an ominous weight. "Let's get this done," Jordan finally said, breaking the silence. He opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air, his body stiff from the tension that had never fully left him. Tyler followed, glancing around as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. His senses were heightened, every small sound amplified in the stillness of the night. He wasn't just paranoid. He knew how close they were to the edge, how fragile their safety truly was. If they had been tracked, if someone had followed them or tipped off the organization, they were sitting ducks out here. "Stay sharp," Tyler muttered, moving around to the trunk of the car. "Can't take any chances." Jordan nodded, already on high alert. They both knew the drill. The safe house had been compromised once before during another operation, and ever since then, they had been extra cautious about their surroundings. This place had served as their base for months, but it wasn't impenetrable. And after tonight's near miss with the cops, the air felt charged with the possibility of danger. Tyler unlocked the trunk, revealing the carefully stashed boxes of evidence. The documents, flash drives, and photos they had risked their lives to obtain were all here, sealed and ready for the final phase of the operation. Jordan leaned in, his eyes scanning over the contents, making sure everything was as it should be. "We need to move this tomorrow," Jordan said, his voice low. "The drop needs to happen soon. The longer we wait, the more risk we're taking." Tyler nodded in agreement. The longer they held onto the evidence, the more vulnerable they became. They had been operating in the shadows for months, walking the fine line between undercover agents and targets. Now, with everything in place, the next 24 hours would decide everything. But as Tyler closed the trunk and stepped back into the quiet of the night, a feeling of unease settled over him. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the nearby trees, and for the first time in a long while, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. "We're almost there," Tyler said, more to reassure himself than Jordan. But even as the words left his mouth, the sense of foreboding gnawed at him. They were so close to bringing down the syndicate, so close to finally closing this case. But the closer they got to the finish line, the more dangerous the ground beneath them became. The night stretched on, vast and empty, and somewhere in the darkness, Tyler knew that the storm was far from over. A web of betrayal. The air inside the safe house was thick with anticipation, its silence punctuated only by the steady hum of old electronics and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Tyler and Jordan had retreated to their makeshift command center, a converted den where laptops and surveillance equipment sat among stacks of files, each one representing months of painstaking work. The walls were covered with photos and maps, each pin and line drawn with the careful precision of a manhunt. The room's dim light cast long shadows, making it feel like they were deep within a labyrinth of secrets and danger. Tyler leaned over one of the tables, his eyes scanning a series of printed photos, grainy surveillance shots of key players in the criminal syndicate. His mind raced with the endless connections they'd uncovered, trying to ensure every piece of the puzzle was in place. They were in the final hours now, the moment when everything either came together or fell apart. This was when the game got deadly. Jordan paced nearby, the tension rolling off him in waves. His earlier frustration from their encounter with the cops hadn't fully dissipated, but it had been redirected, focused now on the mission ahead. The pressure weighed heavily on them both, not just because of the danger, but because of how close they were to the finish line. A wrong step now wouldn't just endanger them, it would unravel the entire operation. Tyler straightened, rubbing his tired eyes. They had been running on adrenaline for what felt like weeks, but exhaustion wasn't an option. Not now. "We've got everything lined up," he said, more to himself than to Jordan. "Once we hand this evidence over to the task force, it's done. The syndicate falls, and we get out of here clean." Jordan paused his pacing and turned to face Tyler. "That's if everything goes according to plan," he said, his tone heavy with doubt. "And how often does that actually happen?" Tyler didn't respond immediately. Jordan had a point. In their line of work, according to plan was more of a hope than a guarantee. And there had been enough complications along the way to make both of them wary. The syndicate they had infiltrated wasn't just some street gang or small-time operation. It was an international network of ruthless criminals. Their reach extended far beyond the city they operated out of, and their influence ran deep. It was the kind of network that had eyes and ears everywhere, and Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "I know the risks," Tyler said finally, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "But we're almost there. One last move, and we're out." Jordan's gaze flickered with uncertainty. "Yeah, if we're not dead first." Tyler couldn't argue with that. The reality was, the deeper they had gone into this mission, the more dangerous it had become. It wasn't just the criminal syndicate they had to worry about. It was the people who had grown suspicious within their own agency, the ones who doubted their ability to pull this off, who saw them as expendable assets rather than agents. In an operation this big, betrayal was always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The safe house felt smaller with each passing minute, the walls closing in as the weight of their situation became more apparent. Tyler moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains just enough to peer outside. The countryside beyond was dark, the trees swaying in the breeze, their branches like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. There was no movement, no sign of life, but Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Something's not sitting right with me," Tyler said, his voice low, as he turned away from the window. "We've been too lucky so far. We've been operating under the radar for months. And now, just as we're about to close the deal, we get stopped by those cops out of nowhere. Feels like more than just a coincidence." Jordan stopped pacing, his brow furrowed. "You think we've been compromised?" Tyler hesitated. It was a question he had been asking himself ever since the traffic stop. It had been too close, too tense, like they had been specifically targeted. But that didn't make sense. The syndicate didn't know who they were, at least. They shouldn't have known. They had been careful. They had followed protocol, covered their tracks. But deep down, Tyler knew that in a game like this, all it took was one small mistake, one slip-up, and everything could come crashing down. "I don't know," Tyler admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "But something feels off. We need to stay sharp. We can't afford to let our guard down now." Jordan nodded, but the tension between them remained. They had both been in this line of work long enough to know that gut feelings, more often than not, were worth listening to. And Tyler's gut was telling him that the storm was closer than they realized. Suddenly, the faint sound of tires crunching on gravel reached their ears. Tyler's head snapped toward the window, and he moved quickly, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer out into the darkness. His heart skipped a beat. Headlights. A single car was making its way up the long, narrow driveway toward the farmhouse. "Company," Tyler muttered under his breath. Jordan was by his side in an instant, his eyes scanning the driveway. "You expecting anyone?" he asked, his voice tight. Tyler shook his head. "No. The task force isn't scheduled to meet us until tomorrow. No one should know we're here." The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the driveway, its headlights cutting off, leaving the night in near-total darkness once more. The stillness that followed was almost deafening, and for a long moment, neither Tyler nor Jordan moved. They didn't need to say it aloud, but both knew what this meant. Whoever was in that car wasn't here by accident. Tyler's mind raced, running through the possibilities. Had someone from the syndicate found them? Was it someone from the Bureau, checking in early? Or worse, was it someone they thought they could trust, but who had betrayed them? The more he thought about it, the more his gut churned with the awful realization that they might have walked right into a trap. "We need to be ready," Tyler said quietly, moving quickly toward the small arsenal they had hidden beneath a floorboard in the den. He lifted the wooden plank and retrieved a pair of handguns, tossing one to Jordan, who caught it with practiced ease. Jordan checked the weapon, his eyes hard. "You think this is it?" Tyler didn't answer. He wasn't sure. But everything in his body told him that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be good. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as they waited, their bodies coiled with tension, ready to spring into action at the slightest hint of danger. The front door creaked as it opened, and Tyler could hear the soft, almost tentative sound of footsteps approaching the house. Whoever it was, they were taking their time, moving with a careful deliberateness that set every nerve on edge. Jordan stood beside the door, his gun raised, his finger hovering near the trigger. Tyler took a position across the room, his weapon aimed at the entryway. They exchanged a quick glance. No words needed. This was what they had trained for. This was the moment they had been preparing for ever since they had first gone undercover. The knock on the door came, soft but insistent. Tyler's grip tightened on his weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. He motioned for Jordan to stay still, then moved toward the door, careful to stay out of sight as he approached. "Who is it?" Tyler called out, his voice calm but firm. There was a pause on the other side of the door. Then a voice, calm, smooth, and unnervingly familiar, responded. "It's me, Agent Davis. Open up. We need to talk." Tyler's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It belonged to someone high up in the Bureau, someone who had been overseeing their operation from the beginning. Agent Curtis Maddox. Tyler glanced at Jordan, who was staring at the door with a look of disbelief. What was Maddox doing here? He wasn't supposed to be involved in the handoff. His role in the operation had been strictly administrative. pulling strings from behind the scenes, not in the field. Tyler's instincts screamed at him to keep the door closed. Maddox wasn't supposed to be here, and that meant only one thing. Something had gone wrong. Very wrong. "I don't think we should let him in," Jordan whispered, his voice tense. "This smells like a setup." Tyler nodded, his mind racing. He had trusted Maddox, had believed he was on their side. But now, standing on the other side of that door, Maddox was more of a threat than an ally. Tyler could feel it in his bones. The knock came again, harder this time. "Davis, open the damn door. We don't have time for this." Tyler hesitated for only a second longer before making his decision. He stepped back from the door, signaling to Jordan to stay ready. "I don't think we're opening the door, Maddox," Tyler called out. "You need to explain why you're here first." There was a pause, and then Maddox's voice came again, colder this time. "I'm here because things have changed. The Bureau isn't the only one with eyes on this operation anymore. We need to talk." Tyler's stomach churned with unease. This was exactly what he had feared. Someone else had gotten wind of their operation. But was Maddox here to help, or had he already switched sides? Before Tyler could respond, the unmistakable sound of more footsteps came from outside, and this time, they weren't soft or tentative. They were heavy, purposeful. Tyler's heart skipped a beat. "Tyler," Jordan hissed, his voice sharp with alarm. "We've got company." Tyler moved quickly back to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. His breath caught in his throat. More figures were emerging from the shadows. Armed men, moving with military precision, surrounding the house. "We're trapped," Jordan muttered, his voice low but filled with a growing sense of dread. "This isn't the Bureau. This is something else." Tyler's mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Had the syndicate found them? Was Maddox playing both sides? Or had the operation been compromised from the very beginning? Outside, the men continued to close in, their weapons at the ready, and Tyler knew that whatever was about to happen, they were running out of time. The storm was here, and there was no way out but through it. No way out but through. The safe house had once been a sanctuary, a hidden refuge from the dangers that came with undercover work. But now, as the night pressed in on Tyler Davis and Jordan Blackwood, the very walls seemed to close in on them. The familiar creaks of the wooden floorboards and the hum of old electronics felt like the prelude to something much darker. Outside, the shadows moved with lethal intent, armed figures positioning themselves with military precision around the perimeter of the house. Every instinct Tyler had honed over years of being an FBI agent screamed one undeniable truth. This was a trap, and their chances of survival were slipping through their fingers. Inside, the air had thickened with the electric charge of impending violence. Tyler's mind raced, his senses heightened to the point of exhaustion, but he forced himself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. They hadn't come this far, risked everything, only to be gunned down without a fight. Across the room, Jordan stood tense, his back pressed against the wall next to the front door, his handgun raised, his finger hovering near the trigger. His eyes, sharp and alert, were fixed on Tyler. "Maddox sold us out," Jordan muttered, his voice low but edged with fury. "That's the only explanation. How else would these guys know exactly where we are?" Tyler couldn't argue with the logic. Maddox, their supposed ally within the Bureau, had shown up unannounced, with an urgency that hadn't felt right from the start. Now, with armed men surrounding the house, it was clear that Maddox's presence wasn't a coincidence. He had led them straight into the jaws of the enemy. Whether Maddox had always been dirty or had been compromised along the way, Tyler didn't know. But one thing was certain. Trusting him now could mean their death. The knock on the door came again, harder this time, followed by Maddox's voice, calm and cold. "Davis, Blackwood, we don't have time for games. Open the door and we'll talk. We need to get this sorted before things get out of hand." Tyler's jaw clenched. The nerve. Maddox was playing the part of the reasonable superior, trying to lull them into compliance, as if the armed men outside weren't a clear indication of his betrayal. Tyler glanced at Jordan, whose eyes were locked on him, waiting for a signal. "We're not opening that door," Tyler whispered, moving silently across the room toward the back, where the surveillance equipment was set up. He flipped through the camera feeds quickly, his eyes scanning the dark images of the exterior. The men surrounding the house were no amateurs. Tyler recognized the tactical gear, the way they moved with coordinated precision. These weren't just street thugs, they were trained professionals, likely mercenaries hired by the syndicate. "What do we do?" Jordan asked, his voice steady despite the danger that pressed in from all sides. Tyler's mind raced through their options. They couldn't fight their way out, not against this many armed men. And they couldn't call for backup. The Bureau wouldn't get there in time. And besides, Maddox had likely already compromised any chance of external support. The safe house had been their sanctuary, but now it had become a trap, and the only way out was through a group of highly trained killers. But they weren't without resources. Tyler's eyes darted to the far corner of the room, where a hidden hatch was built into the floorboards, a backup exit they had installed early in the operation in case things went south. He quickly moved to the hatch and pulled it open, revealing a narrow tunnel that led out to the woods beyond the house. "Here," Tyler said quietly, motioning for Jordan. "We can slip out through this tunnel. It'll get us far enough from the house to escape the perimeter. Once we're in the woods, we'll regroup and figure out our next move." Jordan nodded, moving toward the hatch. But before he could descend, another knock came, this one more forceful than before. Maddox's voice was colder now, edged with irritation. "Last chance, Davis. You open this door, or we're coming in. You know we're not leaving without that evidence." The evidence, that's what this was all about. The documents and files they had spent months gathering were locked in a secure safe beneath the floor, and those files were the key to bringing down the entire syndicate. But now, they were also the target of whatever Operation Maddox and these mercenaries were running. Tyler had no doubt that if Maddox got his hands on the evidence, it would disappear, along with any chance of justice being served. Tyler's eyes narrowed. They couldn't just leave. Not without the evidence, but retrieving it would take time. Time they didn't have with armed men about to breach the house. He turned to Jordan, who had already descended partway into the tunnel. "You go," Tyler said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll hold them off long enough to grab the evidence. Then I'll meet you in the woods." Jordan's face tightened with resistance. "Like hell you're staying behind. We stick together." Tyler shook his head. "There's no time to argue. If we both try to get the evidence, we'll be sitting ducks. I'll grab it and follow. You need to get into the woods and be ready to move." Jordan hesitated for a long moment, his fists clenched, but he knew Tyler was right. Every second they stayed inside the house, their chances of survival dwindled. With a final nod, Jordan disappeared into the tunnel, his body swallowed by the darkness. Tyler moved quickly. He raced to the hidden safe, his fingers working rapidly to unlock the digital keypad. His heart pounded in his chest, every second feeling like an eternity. He could hear the faint sounds of movement outside. Maddox's men positioning themselves, preparing for the breach. With a soft click, the safe opened, revealing the stacks of documents and encrypted flash drives that held the entirety of their investigation. Tyler grabbed them quickly, stuffing everything into a small black duffel bag. He slung the bag over his shoulder and moved toward the tunnel entrance, his mind laser-focused on the plan. But just as he reached the hatch, the front door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Splinters of wood flew in all directions as the door was blown off its hinges, and within seconds, the house was flooded with armed men, their rifles trained on every corner. Tyler dove to the floor, rolling behind an overturned table as bullets tore through the walls and furniture around him. The air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, and the room became a whirlwind of chaos and violence. Tyler's instincts kicked in, his mind moving at lightning speed. He fired back, hitting one of the mercenaries in the chest and sending him crashing to the ground. But there were too many. He couldn't hold them off for long. "Maddox," Tyler shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're not getting what you want." Maddox's voice came from somewhere in the shadows, calm and detached. "You can't win this, Davis. You think you're the only one with a plan. You think your life matters in the grand scheme of this operation." Tyler's blood boiled. Maddox wasn't just playing both sides. He was orchestrating the whole thing. Tyler had always suspected there were people in the Bureau who were willing to sell out their own for the right price, but he hadn't wanted to believe it would come from someone as close to the operation as Maddox. Now, though, the truth was staring him in the face. A hail of bullets tore through the room, forcing Tyler to duck behind the table again. He glanced toward the tunnel. He was running out of time. The mercenaries were closing in, and any hope of escape was dwindling with each passing second. But then, just as Tyler was about to make a desperate dash for the tunnel, something unexpected happened. A loud crack echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Tyler whipped his head around just in time to see Jordan, his body covered in dirt from the tunnel, burst back into the room through a side window, his gun blazing. He moved with the fluidity of a man possessed, his aim precise as he took out two of the mercenaries in quick succession. "Get the hell out of here," Jordan shouted over the gunfire, his eyes wild with determination. "I've got your back." Tyler didn't need to be told twice. With Jordan providing cover, Tyler sprinted toward the tunnel, diving headfirst into the darkness just as another barrage of bullets ripped through the air above him. He landed hard on the dirt floor, the weight of the duffel bag heavy on his shoulder, but he pushed himself up and kept moving, crawling through the narrow tunnel as fast as he could. Behind him, the sounds of gunfire continued, but Tyler didn't slow down. He knew Jordan was buying him time, giving him the chance to escape with the evidence, and as much as it tore at him to leave his partner behind, he knew there was no other choice. Jordan had made his decision, and Tyler had to trust him. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tyler emerged into the cool night air. He stumbled to his feet, his chest heaving with exertion, and scanned the tree line for any sign of Jordan. There was nothing. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest. He turned back toward the tunnel, torn between running and going back for his partner. But just as he was about to make his decision, a figure emerged from the shadows. Jordan, his face smeared with dirt and blood, but very much alive. "Let's go," Jordan said breathlessly, his eyes burning with fierce determination. "We're not done yet." Tyler nodded, his heart swelling with relief and gratitude. Together, they sprinted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness, the duffel bag of evidence still strapped tightly to Tyler's back. The night was far from over, but they were alive. And as long as they were alive, there was still hope. They had survived the storm, and now it was time to bring it crashing down on those who had tried to betray them. No way out but through. And through they would go.